welcome back to this Dialogue Web Extra. I'm Marcia Franklin. We've been talking about interactions between bighorn sheep and domestic sheep, a very complex issue that's indicative of what federal land managers have to deal with every day. This is a follow-up program to a new Outdoor Idaho documentary called The Public's Land. With me are four guests to discuss this issue. Suzanne Rainville is the former supervisor of the Payette National Forest. Margaret Solon-Hinson is the president of the American Sheep Industry Association. Neil Faggard is the former president of the Idaho Wild Sheep Foundation, and now with the Theodore Roosevelt Conservation Partnership in Cody. And in Moscow, Idaho is McCoy Oatman. He is the chair of the Natural Resources Subcommittee for the Nez Perce tribe and a former chairman of that tribe. Welcome to all of you again. Thanks for staying for this additional Web Extra. I want to recap for our viewers what we're talking about and take a look at some maps. The Payette National Forest, we have a map of where it is in Idaho. It's in the south central part of the state. You can see it there. And the Payette National Forest in 2010 released a plan that restricted grazing. This is how grazing was in the brown section, how it originally was. And then in phase 1, it gets smaller. And then phase 2, smaller yet again. And phase 3, yet again. The first phase, which is the largest phase, has already gone into operation and removed about 9,500 sheep. The total amount of domestic sheep that would be removed from the Payette would be close to 13,000. So that's an overview of what happened. The reason it happened was because of disease transmission between bighorn sheep and domestic sheep. Research has shown that domestic sheep carry pneumonia that can be transmitted to bighorn sheep. The issue now is, should this plan be halted? And that's what we're talking about in a nutshell. And let's take some phone calls that we're holding since our main program. We'll start with Brian in Haley. Brian, go ahead, please.
Sure. My question is, why are federal legislators spending our time writing laws to benefit such a small minority of the population? You said 4 on the Payette. That also receives federal subsidies. Huge federal subsidies, radically below market grazing lease fees, prices, taxpayer-funded predator exterminator services, and exploited labor in the form of H-2A immigrant worker visas.
Okay.
Is this an industry worth saving?
All right, I'm going to put you on hold, and let's go right to Margaret Solon-Hinson. Is this an industry? First of all, to the question, there were a lot in there. To the question of your small industry, why do you need this special interest, in his view, legislation?
Well, we are a small industry if you look at industries as a whole, but we're a very important industry. We create a lot of jobs. We provide a lot of raw materials. This is not just about 4 sheep ranchers on the Payette National Forest. This is about almost 25%, a quarter of the domestic production here in this country. Now, not everybody eats lamb, but a lot of people eat lamb. A lot of people wear wool. We provide wool for military use in the flame-resistant antimicrobial fabrics that are very important to our military. We produce lanolin that goes into pharmaceuticals. We are on the outside of tennis balls and on the inside of baseballs. So to say that something is not important just because you maybe don't utilize it or don't believe in it, I beg to differ.
And to the issue of subsidies, we had an email as well from somebody in Nampa who says that Mr. Simpson's appropriation rider is a glaring example of his constituents' narrow agenda and disregard for scientifically grounded policies. Why are Idaho taxpayers hit both ways, subsidizing the sheep ranchers that graze on federal lands and spending more tax dollars to replenish decimated bighorn populations after the same domestics spread lethal pneumonia? This makes no sense scientifically, especially in fiscally conservative Idaho. Another person writing in talking about subsidies for your
Certainly,
industry.
and I would say that, you know, everybody refers to subsidies. I guess I would have to look at it and say, you know, a lot of things are subsidized in this country. Recreation is certainly subsidized in this country. And, you know, because there are Farm Bill programs out there and available, and producers participate in those programs, you know, I think everybody that has programs available participates in them. So
And there were many other feelings he had about the sheep industry, including labor.
He's
issues
obviously
as well.
not a fan of ours.
So I think there were a lot of questions to answer there. I'll move to you. Any response to the issue of a narrow interest group and subsidies?
Well, here's what I will say. From the Bighorn sheep advocacy side of things, this is not an issue about Bighorn sheep or domestic sheep. This should be Bighorn sheep and domestic sheep. But, you know, we have to keep in mind that Idaho's wildlife is very important to the economy as well. You're talking, you know, our wildlife here is an $800 million a year industry. I hate to call it an industry, but for lack of better terms, that's what it is. You can break that down a little more localized in the Payette area. You know, we've already talked about the amount of money that domestic sheep operators on the Payette were paying the federal government for their cost of AUMs, you know, $1.35 a month for AUMs. Well, those producers were providing the federal government about $17,000 to $18,000 a year in those use fees. You have tour boat operators who are advertising, showing people wildlife in the Snake River Canyon. And a big part of their promotion is bighorn sheep viewing. Those operators provide the federal government $90,000 a year in use fees. And then on top of that, you got 30,000 visitors plus per year that sign in at the Hells Canyon National Recreation Area. According to the Washington Department of Tourism, those 30,000 visitors spend an average of $140 a day per person in that local economy.
Let's take a call from David in Council. David, go ahead, please.
Are you there?
I am.
Yes, well, my concern is, the concern is I realize with the domestic sheep and the disease and everything. But at the same token, I was born and raised here in the Payette National Forest. I hunt and fish in the Hells Canyon area all my life. I'm 51 years old. And if this is such an issue, then why are we still issuing tags to kill these animals?
Okay, good question. I'll put you on hold and we'll talk to Neil about that.
Well, I can almost bet that the Nez Perce tribe will have a different approach on this than I do. But the thing to keep in mind is the hunting of bighorn rams is very restricted. Wildlife managers set up allocations for permits to allow the take of some bighorn sheep rams. The rams have little bearing on the viability of the population of bighorn sheep. What is happening is the disease transmission is causing all-age massive die-offs and poor lamb recruitment in the bighorn sheep populations. We're not harvesting lambs. We're harvesting a few rams on an annual basis.
McCoy?
Yeah, I mean, I think the tribe's end goal is to get the population to a healthy, harvestable level. Historically, I think if you look at the populations, you can see that they're nowhere near the levels they were previously at, and that's where the tribe really wants to see this go, so that we're able to take our kids out there, the future generations out there, and they're able to practice their treaty rights to go out there and harvest these animals, teach these kids how to make those bighorn sheep bows again, and how to process these animals, and how to make the shirts that were a prized trade resource. And so, you know, that's we're just as concerned too of the killing of the animals, but we're hoping that, you know, through this decision, that we're able to get them back to our end goal, to healthy, harvestable levels.
Okay, and let's take a call from Tony in Payette. Tony, go ahead, please.
Hi. I'd like to know, it says that you had 25% of the ranchos that are impacted. It doesn't say how much they're impacted in that 25%. So why in the 20 years that I know of that they have been allowed to utilize this ground to the devastation of our bighorn sheep?
I think what she might be referring to is, hold on, we'll put you on hold, Tony. She may be referring to what you mentioned nationwide.
Right.
Maybe you could repeat.
Tony, what I might clarify for you is when we're talking about 25% of our domestic sheep production in this country utilizes that 1 million acres of Forest Service land that's within bighorn habitat.
So that's nationwide.
That's nationwide.
Not just the Payette.
Not just the Payette, not just in Idaho. That's nationwide.
Okay. And Roy in Boise. Roy, go ahead, please.
Yes, Marcia, thank you for taking my call. I have to compliment you on your guests this evening. They're all very professional in their responses to questions. The question I have has to do with the proposal to use vaccination approach, and that sounds a little bit anti-Darwinian to me a little bit. I wonder if someone could address that. Thank you.
In what respect?
The whole idea of using vaccinations on wild sheep is it's a bit much. I don't know who would fund that kind of thing or how it would be accomplished.
Okay, good question. Hold on just a second. Yes, the sense of vaccinating a wild animal. When he says anti-Darwinian, I assume he says it's better thinking it's better to have natural resistance, and then also how would you do it physically?
Yeah, the big problem with vaccinating bighorn sheep is all you have to do is go and take a look at bighorn sheep habitat and figure out how. Yeah, it's very rugged. Heck, we've had cases where we've had bighorn sheep that were known to be sick, be pneumonic, who had tracking collars on them. And it would take days for someone from the Idaho Fish and Game Department to be able to run them down, even using aircraft, to be able to take the sheep out. So to be able to administer vaccines is logistically tough. I'm not saying it's impossible, but why is the brunt being put on the bighorn sheep?
Well, you see this man jabbing, the bighorn. In the Wallowas, there for years have been feeding programs going on where the bighorn come right up to the researchers, and here you see them swabbing for disease. So there are some herds that can be accessed.
Right.
But not all.
Yeah, and I would say that, when we talk about the vaccination, people tend to think of it in a very narrow way, that we're going to give injections to all the bighorns and whatnot. In reality, what you can do is you can work backwards from the processes. We've been able to demonstrate that bighorns can develop immunity through a vaccination. So we've dispelled that myth that they cannot develop an immune response, and that's really critical. But then you can work backwards and you can look at domestic sheep and see what is it that domestic sheep have that have allowed them to have an immunity, and then can we do something within the domestic sheep population to prevent them from shedding, if that's the issue. So there's a lot of different avenues you can take on when you're talking about the research and vaccination and finding mechanisms for compatibility.
What's confusing for me as a reporter, and I think confusing for some people as well, is that you don't see a lot of pictures of bighorn sheep and domestic sheep touching noses in the herds together. So it seems quite a mystery as to how this happens.
But there are documented cases. There are photos that are out there that show the commingling of the two species. So it does happen, and it is very difficult to document that. Of course, we can flip the tables, and we can take a look at the brucellosis issue amongst cattle, bison, and elk. We can't document contact in free-range settings, but the anecdotal evidence is there that shows that it does occur.
And then the bison are killed.
Yes.
That carry
bison and elk.
Carrying the brucellosis.
Correct.
And Marcia, that's for the Forest Service and the analysis they have to do. The whole issue of, is there contact? Is there disease spread? All the research, the vaccines. That's something that the Forest Service and their analysis don't have. There's opposing arguments, and they don't have all those answers. And so that forces then us to look at it differently in terms of risk of contact, or what's the chances of a ram's going to foray out, and then how do you do the separation? And so the Forest Service isn't going to provide answers to these bigger scientific questions. until they're answered, in the meantime, they got to figure out a way across the nation how you maintain that separation.
On a personal basis, Margaret, the Forest Service decision to start restricting domestic grazing, how has that affected you?
We sold 2,000 head last year. We're selling more sheep this year. We'll end up losing 60% of our domestic sheep operation.
And what about the idea of just paying you for having had this happen? You know, some sort of damages program, if you will. And I mean, it's been used before, and it's certainly with the ranchers in the Sawtooth area. They were paid not to develop their land so that that scenic easement is still there. What about that idea?
You know, Marcia, Justice McCoy spoke very eloquently about the Bighorns and their culture and whatnot. Raising sheep has been in my family for over 80 years. It's an operation that my grandfather, my father, and we have carried on and built. We have employees that we love, that are part of our family, that depend upon us. So, you know, just paying us off isn't really, it doesn't do much for me. I'll put it that way. It really doesn't.
So that's not an option. I know that that's been brought up as a potential option for some operators, or to potentially change to a cow-calf operation instead of sheep. But you're sheep.
We have cow-calf. I'm a sheep person.
Part of our collaborative processes were to look at those issues. What alternatives can we revert to? What can we do with livestock type conversions? What can we look at as far as alternative grazing allotments, alternative grazing practices? The bottom line is we have to have, Bighorn sheep have to be free of the vector within their habitat. That's the bottom line.
The disease vector, you mean?
The disease vector.
But see, Neil, you just spoke back again as to why creating the space for a timeout is really very desirable, so that we can take and address those needs that are out there, because we haven't been able to make progress in those areas.
Well, we haven't, but right now we don't have time for the Bighorn sheep. We've had, 2009, 2010, there were die-offs in numerous states. And you stated earlier, Margaret, that there was no contact, and what there was is some of those cases there was no documented contact, but in places where those die-offs occurred, Bighorn sheep and domestic sheep were in proximity. And there were some cases where there was documented contact. The one thing we do know is where Bighorn sheep are not forced to share their range with domestic sheep, Bighorn sheep do not become pneumonic. We don't have large-scale, all-age die-offs.
So what's...
Marcia, can I interject?
Yeah, go ahead, McCoy, please.
Yeah, I just wanted to make a statement or reiterate the statement I had made earlier, that we don't feel that the burden should fall on the Bighorn sheep. With the 5-year timeout, I feel that the tribe feels like the burden would fall on the Bighorn sheep. And I understand Margaret's point, about her family and about how long they have been involved in domestic sheep grazing and what it means to them. And I would be remiss if I didn't, state, like I said before, I'm a 7th generation descendant of old Chief Looking Glass. And in 1855, when they negotiated the treaty, it was put in there that we would still have the right to go hunt. And by these populations declining, that makes it rather difficult for us to go out and practice and pass this on to our kids. And when we're not able to do that, we're not able to pass it even on to adults to go out there and practice these rights. It impacts their daily lives. And so that's just something that I wanted to state on behalf of the tribe.
Thank you very much. And I just want to ask, what's the next step? What's the timeline, you think, for finding out whether this rider to the appropriations bill will pass that calls for a timeout on these issues?
Yeah, Congress, who knows, but I think we'll know something by middle of November or so, 1st of December.
And
my guess.
if this does pass and is attached to the appropriations bill, What will Bighorn advocates, what's the next step, do you think, Neil?
That's a good question, and I don't think I have the answer for that at this point. There may be different steps taken by different groups.
In terms of lawsuits potentially?
Potentially. I mean, we know that there's groups out there that love to litigate over these types of issues. We would rather see this resolved without, and I'm speaking with the Idaho Wild Sheep Foundation or Theodore Roosevelt Conservation Partnership, is that, you know, we'd rather see these things resolved through other measures. Legislation that trumps best science and litigation are not the answers for anyone. I don't think the results that come from that or anything that either side wants, whether it's the domestic sheep industry or Bighorn sheep advocates.
Well, we'll watch this issue and we'll see what happens, and whether people come to the table yet again, and see what the result is. I want to thank all of my guests for continuing this dialogue discussion on Bighorn sheep issues. I'm Marcia Franklin. Thanks for tuning in.